60% mental and 40% physical.
Math was never our strong suit, but breaking down Ohio State football is. Sit back and join us for Buckeye Grove Instant Access, part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network.
You can do it!
Brought to you by BuckeyeGrove.com. Post-game thoughts, immediate analysis, and much, much more to put the big game into perspective. Without any further delay of game, here's your host, Kevin Noon.
Kevin, goddammit.
Hey, it's Monday morning. Welcome into the BIA Buckeye Grove Instant Access Podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon. I'll be joined momentarily with one of our fantastic interns, Jacob Binge. We are talking Big Ten football scheduling. And this may not be the first show that we've done talking about it. We're on version 3.0 of Ohio State's Big Ten schedule, but God willing, this is going to be the one that's going to ride. We are just a little bit more than a month away from when games are supposed to start, the weekend of the 23rd, 24th. We don't have any Friday games announced at this point, but we'll get to that in a second. But, you know, before we get any further into it, let me welcome in Jacob, and we will kind of just go from there. Jacob, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
Hey, Kevin, I'm doing well. I'm excited to be back on the podcast. I'm even more excited with the fact that we got Schedule 3.0 and we can look forward to week one.
Exactly. And it, rewind a couple weeks ago, and us being at this point seemed almost like an impossibility. The Big Ten doubled down, said we are not revisiting this, deal with it. You might get, you might get November football, you might get January football, you might not get any football. Lo and behold, here we are, October football, not the 10th date that we had talked about, not even the 17th, the 24th, but, an interesting 8+1 model. Everybody's going to get 9 games out of it. If, Ohio State's schedule goes the way everybody believes it will, that 9th game will be a Big Ten championship game, but everybody getting a chance to participate in that 9th week. But, overall thoughts just on first glance of Ohio State's schedule that was released over the weekend.
Yeah, for sure. So Griffin, Marcus, and we put out our predicting the final or the championship week schedule, and I opened my predictions with Ohio State isn't going to get back to the Big Ten title game because they have the easiest schedule. I think their schedule gets a little interesting in the later half, particularly with Indiana, Illinois, Michigan State, and Michigan all right there in a row. So those are my kind of takeaways just initially from looking at it.
I think the first thing that jumped off of the page to me, and it was something I'd been predicting for a couple of days since we'd gotten the schedule put back together, and we knew we were going to be getting a schedule, that Ohio State opening with Nebraska. And I guess it really depends on your point of view, whether or not somebody in the scheduling department had a sense of humor, or somebody was really vindictive, or if it was just a little bit of happenstance. And we can kind of get in the genesis of how, Ohio State's crossover opponents happen. But, starting with Nebraska, it was really Nebraska in a lot of ways that got this ball rolling to really fight. I mean, and that's not to say Ohio State was not fighting to get an October schedule, a meaningful season, to be able to be part of the college football playoff discussion and everything else. But, let's be real. When Nebraska's, AD and Nebraska's president or chancellor comes out and they're pretty emphatic, and then the lawsuit comes from Nebraska athletes and everything else, and lo and behold, they get scheduled against Ohio State, the other team that was very vocal, especially as time went on. But even more importantly, Ohio State, an overwhelming favorite to win the Big Ten and, probably be a double-digit favorite most of the way through the season, really sets up a lot of interesting subplots there in week one.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm really speculative that happened by chance, the matchup between Nebraska and Ohio State in week one. I was also entertained by the fact that Ohio State and Nebraska's Twitter handles were going back and forth at each other with stepbrothers gifts, kind of being how did we just become best friends, and then having to compete against one another come week one on October 24th.
Exactly. So, that'll be an interesting game. I've already seen a couple of writers go out and start predicting the lines. I've seen 24. I mean, Nebraska, and we'll have time to go through and really start breaking down opponents. You need to see, who had players opt out, so on and so forth. And really any long range planning this season is kind of a moot point because of just the highly flexible, maybe uncertain nature of, what could happen if a player tests positive or is contact traced back to somebody who does test positive. So, you really don't know anything until you see who lines up on that Saturday or Friday, to be honest. But Ohio State certainly seems to be an overwhelming favorite going into that, whether or not you're buying 17, 24 or more points in that line.
Yeah, those betting lines are really going to be something to look at because watching the big noon broadcasts and hearing all the confidence put on Ohio State and how wide those margins are going to be, it's something I'm going to be checking each week, I know for sure, especially early on with Nebraska, Rutgers, and Maryland in 3 of the first 4 games. That Penn State matchup might not be as wide, of course, so that'll remain to be seen.
Right, and we go right into week 2, and Ohio State travels to Happy Valley. Halloween, assuming that game doesn't get moved to the 30th, that would just be ridiculous. Not going to be a whiteout because they're not going to be fans in the stands. There were provisions put in potentially for some player families to be able to be in attendance for games, but 500, tops compared to 110,000, very different environment. It makes sense to me to play the game at night. It's just such a marquee game. It's going to be, as long as the pollsters get their polls back aligned to kind of where they were preseason, top 10 matchup for sure. It's the de facto Big Ten East championship game. Apologies to anybody else in the division, but sucks to suck. It's going to be one of these two teams. So and you're doing it right there in week 2, and it takes a game that probably under normal circumstances would have been a hell of a lot more scary and levels the playing field, at least in terms of the environment, even if, Ohio State certainly probably from 1 to 85 and 1 to 22 on its roster more talented than Penn State, but it's been a pretty close series, especially in State College through the years.
Yeah, for sure. There's been back and forth matchups, interesting contests between these two teams. The fact that it's on Halloween just adds to the element of suspense. And I'll match your Halloween spooky, jokes here. And the ghost of Micah Parsons and his situation at Penn State, could he opt back in and return to that team, remains to be seen. But his addition to that defense could definitely be an interesting fact in holding down Ohio State and what they'll bring in week 2, assuming that they'll come in after a week 1 matchup against Nebraska relatively well.
Right, exactly. Micah Parsons, certainly a game changer, a player that's had some success against Ohio State, at least in terms of individually. He would change that line by a couple of points just with his return. And we're still, as of the time we're recording this, waiting to kind of hear what the NC2A is going to rule on the opt-ins. Ohio State having a pair of them with Shaun Wade and with Wyatt Davis. To be determined at this point, but you got to figure that the path will be cleared for them. But we'll get to that at a later point. Next couple weeks for Ohio State's schedule, you never want to sit there and just completely write off somebody, but Rutgers at home and at Maryland the following 2 weeks. Don't get hurt, don't get sick, play your game, get the hell out of there. Those are both games that probably should be played once and only once. We don't need to see those again.
You're exactly right, especially with the fact that not getting sick and not getting injured. Those 2 weeks are going to be critical in building up for the matchup after those 2. And if I had to pick between Rutgers or Maryland, which game I'd be more nervous about, I say that relatively lightly. I think Rutgers might present a bigger threat this year than Maryland does, just because they return their quarterback they returned their leading rusher, and Greg Schiano and the staff at Rutgers. They haven't won a conference game in 2 seasons. So could they challenge Ohio State? Maybe not as likely as another team in the East for one of their West crossovers. But Rutgers, I'd be a little more weary of than Maryland this season.
You see, and I'm going to take the other side on there. One, mostly because the Maryland game is on the road, and while Ohio State will already have a road game under its belt, you're still dealing with travel and everything else. I understand Maryland's had pretty much half its team opt out, but, Rutgers could have all 22 returning from a team that wasn't very good, and I understand you have a new head coach in there and whatnot, but they're just so bad. Rutgers is just so bad right now. I mean, I really think that Greg Schiano is going to be able to find a thing or two with this Rutgers team in years to come, but year one is going to be he's going to just be dunked into the fire at this point. They just don't have the roster. They haven't had the recruiting, and ultimately that's what you need at that program is you need the recruiting to be able to at least live within the middle of this conference, and they haven't had it at this point. I just don't know if they're going to be able. They were more active than anybody else out there in terms of the transfer portal. They went out, got a couple of former Buckeyes. I mean, they certainly will have an infusion of talent, but you're also dealing with guys who've come into a program who did not have the benefit, if they got in there early enough, of spring football, did not have the benefit really of summer or early fall. I mean, everybody was able to go to the 12-hour weeks after the Big Ten dumped the schedule dumped the season for the first time. But, I don't know. I mean, they're going to have as much time as anybody else to prepare, but even add to this, New Jersey was under more restrictive measures than a lot of other states, so you don't even know what they were able to do at the time where Ohio State was able to at least lift weights and whatnot. But, I guess we're really kind of arguing the same point. Neither Rutgers nor Maryland should pose a huge issue, but you got to play the games. But, both of those just kind of seem to be, if you're gonna take any international travel during the football season, I would do it one of those 2 weeks.
That's a good point, and no one's really expecting Rutgers to come out of the gate and surprise everybody this year. And I give Maryland props a little bit. They got Tua Tagovailoa's brother on their roster somewhere. And if the first 3 weeks of the season, if he's not starting, out of the gate, or whoever is starting, could allow for him to get in there and make things interesting come week 4, I'm all for that. That'll make for an even better game to watch.
Well, better, I guess, is the operative term there. Better. We turn the corner into the second half of the season in this 8-game sprint, not including the 9th game. Indiana comes to town. The games against the Hoosiers have been probably a little bit better in Bloomington than they have in Columbus. Really, we can just lump that and at Illinois together. I think the biggest thing I'll say about at Illinois is even under the best of circumstances, it's cold and windy and blustery in Champaign. That stadium was built to be a wind tunnel. I don't know if it was on purpose or accident, but it's always a mess. Ohio State better have its run game ready, because playing at the very end of November, I don't think the elements are really going to be in anybody's favor for a prolific passing attack.
I think I'll touch more on some weather elements come later on in the schedule, but Illinois and Indiana are kind of a couple wild cards in my opinion when looking at the schedule, because Illinois had that big win over Wisconsin last season at home, and it just is something that'll keep you on your toes when you go and play Illinois. And Indiana is a team that has Michael Penix Jr. potentially at quarterback, and his dual threat nature could make for some interesting defensive plays when the Buckeyes are on the field. And they also have a 1,000-yard receiver for when he doesn't decide to use his legs a little bit. But like I looked at in ranking schedule 2.0, the Buckeyes haven't scored less than 27 against Indiana since the early 90s. So if the Hoosiers are going to want to, play spoiler or surprise or, stay in the game, they're going to have to figure out a way to slow that Ohio State offense.
Absolutely. And the Buckeyes have managed to avoid Michael Penix Jr. in previous games, whether or not it was a case of them playing Peyton Ramsey, Penix Jr. being hurt, at least in one of those years. So he certainly will be one of the better quarterbacks that Ohio State will face. And let's not forget, Indiana was not a terrible team last year. Unfortunately for them, the last impression they left on everybody was absolutely imploding in their bowl game. So, being able to compete with Ohio State may be a little bit of a big ask, but this isn't a 2-win type of Indiana team. But coming into Columbus, certainly, and I get it. And we'd already kind of talked about the fact that there won't be fans in attendance. So, what does home field really mean outside of a travel roster size that you're bringing a number of guys and having to stay in hotels or whatever? But until I see otherwise, home field is still at least worth a little something, even if it's not worth as much. But we get to December, and then Ohio State starts its tour of the state of Michigan. It goes up to East Lansing on December 5th, and then of course, the finale will be against Michigan here in Columbus. We'll start with that Sparty game. Mel Tucker's first year there after the sudden departure of Mark D'Antonio. Talk about a team that is depleted. That would be the Spartans. If Rocky Lombardi ends up winning the quarterback duel up there, probably not a good thing in terms of where their offense is going to stand. But on the flip side, I don't think I could even name anybody he's competing against for the starting quarterback position. Once again, another indictment over the fact that I think that they're really going to struggle this year.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of turnover at Michigan State, and it starts from the coaching all the way down to the roster. I think their defense is going to be relatively lacking after losing their interceptions leader in Josiah Scott and their sacks leader in Kenny Wilecki. I was relatively high on Michigan State in my Champions Week matchup predictions, having them at number 3. And that just comes down to, having a good week, gelling at the right times. But in December, at home against Ohio State, it's really going to be all about momentum there, and if Mel Tucker can figure something out when the season's winding down.
Yeah, I think that we remember a lot of the issues that Sparty was having down the stretch toward the end of the D'Antonio era, and it's easy to just carry that forward and say, okay, well, that's going to continue. We don't know what Mel Tucker's impact is going to be, but I liken it to what I said about Rutgers in terms of I think it's going to take a little bit of time, and to say that Michigan State was recruiting at the same level of Rutgers is just a patent falsehood. I mean, they recruit a lot better, but with that being said, I think that we saw a bit of a talent drain in some key positions. And you're right, they don't have a Kenny Wilecki walking through that door right now. They don't have a Josiah Scott on that roster right now. I just don't see the difference makers on that roster really at any position right now. And the truth of the matter is that that's week 7 of the season. What happened? They could be 2-5, and I don't even have their schedule in front of me. We'll go over the rest of the Big Ten schedule on the other side of a break. But they could be 2-5 at that point, and you're really going to learn about this team if they're going to get up for this game and be able to give Ohio State their best go, or if they are sitting in that position and they just fold and be like, well, we really didn't even want to play in the first place. We were told there'd be no football this year. It could get ugly.
It certainly could, and I think Mel Tucker is going to have to reinstill that attitude of, hey, let's go out and play some football this fall. Of course, they're going to hold that. And like I said earlier, it's going to be momentum. Just taking a look at Michigan State's schedule in front of me here, they start out against Rutgers, so they could ride some momentum into Michigan week 2. We'll dive more into that, I'm sure, later on. But Michigan State, a lot of turnover is going to be their focus and seeing where they go in the years to come.
And then, of course, we always have to talk about the looking ahead, and the big game of the season is the following week. Michigan comes to town, back to its rightful spot, not toward the middle of the season, as in Schedule 2.0. It'll be interesting. People are going to be like, well, there's going to be a foot of snow on the ground. Well, whenever we get snow in Columbus, it always seems to be after January 1st. But it's going to be a lot more likely that there'd be snow on the ground in mid-December than in late November, but you just never know. But I mean, it's probably not going to be a balmy 60 degrees or anything by any stretch of the imagination. And you know, this is going to be the game that's going to, you know, set everything up at this point. I mean, Ohio State probably, if it runs through its first 7 games just fine, is going to be sitting top 3 in the nation at worst. I'm old enough to remember through the years where Michigan has come in with maybe the less talented team and beaten Ohio State. That has stopped since Jim Tressel set foot in Columbus. We've not seen that. We've not really seen any Michigan wins to speak of during that time. It will be the game that everybody will be watching. I mean, it's going to be the weekend of potentially some of the major conference championship games, but I guarantee you this game is going to draw just, you know, ridiculous numbers on television.
I really agree, and it'd be a Christmas miracle if it were 60 degrees come December 12th. But yeah, I'm going to be really interested to cover the first game in December between these two teams when they do play, and I think there's going to be some interesting points to watch, whether what Harbaugh is going to do with his quarterback situation, how his team is going to look when they come to Columbus, then, and the fact that it's, you know, the rivalry game here is going to add some element. And like, I can't hit on December enough. This matchup in December is something that sticks out to me.
And, you know, remember this too, and we have to go back in our Wayback Machine, but we certainly talked about there was some bad blood on a coach's call between Jim Harbaugh and Ryan Day over the belief that maybe Ohio State was doing stuff at a certain point that it shouldn't in terms of coach participation in practices. And if you believe the rumors out there, and I certainly heard them, Ryan Day didn't take very kindly to that and may or may not have said something about trying to hang 100 on these guys. And, 100, it's been a minute since Ohio State scored 100. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was 1933 or 1913. It was a long time ago and a very different era of football. But conversely, Ohio State really has not run into any resistance against the Don Brown-led defenses over the last couple of years. And Ohio State kind of called the dogs off in the last game and only got into the 50s, but the year before that got into the 60s in Urban Meyer's last year as Ohio State's head coach. You know, I don't think that there's going to be any reason why Ohio State would try to lay up at the end. It's just going to be a weird year. I don't think that I'm going to say Ohio State's going to be throwing the ball with 60 seconds left in the game, but this is going to be a year that the looks test means the most in terms of the College Football Playoff Committee. And truth be told, this game is going to probably carry more weight than a Big Ten championship game just based on the brand names. And maybe just because I'm not overly impressed with what I've seen out of the West in terms of how things are shaping up there. I think Ohio State's going to try and really pour it on.
Yeah, I agree there. You mentioned, I mean, if it comes down to the last minute, Ohio State has no need to go throwing the football just to get that 100th point up on the scoreboard when they're already hanging 100 Christmas lights up on the scoreboard come that time. Yeah, I agree that this game is going to carry a lot of weight because Justin Fields said the other day, I mean, the College Football Playoff Selection Committee shouldn't have to worry about however many games, you know, the Big Ten teams are playing versus the SEC teams. But he did say that Ohio State likely will have to go undefeated in order to, you know, garner their interest come the end of the season. And playing Michigan in December for the first time is going to add some weight into their resume. And if Ryan Day and his team backs up his statement that he claimed on that conference call, even in the slightest and halfway scoring measures, they're going to sway that selection committee.
Exactly, because as I said, I mean, it's based on schedules. This could be the same weekend that Alabama and Georgia or Alabama and Florida or whatever the SEC championship game is going to be. So it would be imperative not to get lost in the shuffle, to go out there and make as strong of an impression as you can. So what does that look like? I don't know. I don't know. Does Ohio State get through all 8 games? I mean, that's not entirely on Ohio State. I mean, that's also going to be on its opponents. And, we're not operating with much of a safety net, any safety net, really. 8 games over 8 weeks. What happens if IU or Michigan State or somebody just, doesn't take care of business in terms of their own health and safety, and they have to shut down for a week and a game gets canceled because there are no postponements. You're not going to be shuffling the deck to be able to play this game or that game or whatever. So it'll be interesting. A lot of unknowns, but I'm gonna take us to the break real quick, and then on the flip side, we will talk about the Big Ten schedule in general and maybe make a couple of predictions. But just keep on listening here to the BIA podcast. Egg Water Conditioning has been treating well in city water in Central Ohio with American-made water filtration products for over 60 years. Have a water quality problem? The water treatment experts at Hague know how to solve it. Not sure if your water softener is working? They will test, inspect, and sanitize any brand of water softener for only $20. Schedule a system checkup or water test today by calling 614-836-2195 or visit them online at HagueH2O.com. That's HAGUE H2O.com. Welcome back to the BIA podcast. I am your host, Kevin Noon. I am joined by Jacob Binge, and we are talking Big Ten football schedule. So now let's kind of turn the page and look at the conference on the whole. And Nebraska, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, really didn't get any favors from the Big Ten computer or the Big Ten commissioner or whoever was involved in this process. When you look at their first 4 weeks at Ohio State, home against Wisconsin, at Northwestern, and then home against Penn State. It certainly appears that a message was sent. I mean, maybe I'm a little naive in saying that it's just kind of what happened, but to have it all happen there in the first 4 weeks and the potential be sitting 1-3 right there before a November 21st game against Illinois, not a great draw.
Yeah, for sure. If I had to note a positive, I mean, at least those home matchups against Wisconsin and Penn State are in Nebraska rather than on the road. I think Adrian Martinez is going to have to come out and prove his worth against those teams, of course, especially early on with, the considerable Big Ten East and West favorites week 1 and 2.
Something I want to say about how the schedules were put together is that your opponents were picked out of what Schedule 1.0 had. So it wasn't like teams suddenly had new opponents thrown onto the schedule for, the sake of being given an easy schedule, the sake of being given a difficult schedule. These were opponents you were supposed to play anyway. You were supposed to have a 9-game conference schedule that's now down to 8. So you were going to lose 1. And truth be told, I mean, in that setup, 2 were going to be on the road, or 2 were going to be at home, and 1 was on the road, or the other way around. So it really became kind of a coin flip in terms of which team it was going to be that you're going to lose. And there are some protected crossover type of scenarios in there. So I don't think it's as much of a surprise. And for everybody who's saying that Nebraska got really railroaded here, and there are people around that program that have not been very quiet about the fact they feel that they kind of got abused a little bit here. I think Nebraska has to be thankful, though, that they play in the Big Ten West and not the Big Ten East. I mean, if they're complaining about having to draw Ohio State and Penn State, if they played in the East, they'd have to play them every year.
Yeah, 100% agreeable there. In the West, there are teams that could pop up as wild card teams, whereas in the East, you have mainstays in terms of talent. And Nebraska, like you mentioned earlier, they were clamoring for a season, so they're going to have a chance to put up for it this fall.
And everybody trying to say that Ohio State really got a break. Okay, I mean, their crossover games are Nebraska and Illinois, but let's be honest here. Ohio State does not have to play Ohio State. And if Ohio State is the number one seed in the Big Ten at this point, for, lack of a better description. Until Ohio State has to play Ohio State, they immediately have an advantage in terms of who it is that they're going to have to play. I mean, everybody else who ends up drawing Ohio State has to say, well, we got Ohio State on our schedule. Well, Ohio State isn't going to have to play Ohio State. So, it's one of these situations of where when you're the top team, I think it just automatically looks a little bit easier on the schedule because you don't go down the schedule and see your own team on there.
I agree with that, and having that notion of confidence, knowing that you're usually the top team in that conference, goes Ohio State's way. But to play devil's advocate in a sense, Ohio State doesn't always look towards playing Michigan at the end of each year, knowing that they're the other best team in the Big Ten, whereas it could be Northwestern one year, it could be Wisconsin another one. Having that disadvantage of having to prepare for a new team every season could add some challenges in the scouting ranks, whereas other teams are like, okay, Ohio State, we know Shaun Wade or Jeff Kuda in the secondary and Justin Fields, J.K. Dobbins, and the rest of that offense is going to show up come the season's end. So that could be one disadvantage of being the top dog in a sense.
Well, and Ohio State, I mean, let's be real. Penn State's been the next best team in the conference for a couple of years now, and Ohio State's going to draw them week 2, so it'll be interesting. Staying within the Eastern Division, Michigan got a pretty interesting draw. In the first 4 weeks, it's got Minnesota, Michigan State, Indiana, and Wisconsin, and Minnesota. I think a lot of Minnesota is going to be predicated whether or not Rashad Bateman is able to opt back in or not. Michigan State is obviously a rivalry game. I really don't think the Spartans are going to be very good this year. Indiana is Indiana, but that game is going to be in Bloomington and not Ann Arbor. And then Wisconsin. I mean, could Michigan already have a couple of losses on its schedule by the time, by the time that we get to even close to Thanksgiving?
That's certainly something to watch, and I think that 4-game draw could have been a lot easier, and it could go either way. And if Joe Milton, who Urban Meyer has some favor to as Michigan's quarterback, if he shows out those first 4 weeks, Michigan could be sitting a little bit prettier when their schedule gets, a little bit easier with Rutgers and Maryland in the latter half. But just as you mentioned, Michigan State the second week and then another home draw against Wisconsin. Certainly, going on the road against Minnesota and Indiana, those are 2 tough road matchups there, considering Minnesota's strong season last year and Indiana just with Penix and that wild card team.
Taking Ohio State's games off the board, what's a game or two that you are most looking forward to seeing here in this upcoming Big Ten season, provided that all these games actually do occur?
Yeah, for sure. So just looking at what I've highlighted so far in the schedule, early on there are a lot of interesting matchups. Michigan, Minnesota, Penn State, Indiana in week 1 alone. Those are 2 that I'm going to keep tabs on when they're being played and keep watching the scoreboard. Later on in the season, Michigan, Wisconsin, of course, in Ann Arbor is going to be an interesting matchup. And if Indiana, a team that I'm relatively high on, continues to meet my expectations, they have a matchup on the road against Wisconsin in the second to last week of the season. So that could have some implications if Indiana is making a run towards the top of the East or if Wisconsin's trying to nail down another Big Ten title appearance. I like that matchup come December 5th, Indiana and Wisconsin.
I think the first game that comes to my mind is going to be last week of the season, Iowa, Wisconsin. I think that's going to be a big game in determining what's going to happen in the Big Ten West. I think the Wisconsin-Minnesota game is a real important game as well. I've not been a huge proponent of Jack Cohn at Wisconsin. I think Graham Mertz is still the future for them up there. But, I'm curious to see for Wisconsin who the next running back is going to be now that Jonathan Taylor is in the league. And, just seems that Wisconsin just, cranks up the machine and another 1,000-yard rusher just, comes rolling right out and does what they need to do. If I had to pick another game in the Big Ten East, I mean, obviously Penn State, Michigan is going to be important November 28th. I would be more interested in that Penn State Iowa game if that game were in Iowa City. That game is going to be in State College, and again, I know no fans. That Kinnick magic. I mean, it's a moot point at this point. Might not happen in that situation, but I think that's certainly a type of trip-up game for the Nittany Lions with Michigan just a week afterwards. So, there are a lot of interesting games. No filler, no bye games, none of that stuff in this schedule. I mean, we can sit there and laugh at the Rutgers of the world and say that that's, essentially a bye game. But, with that being said, a lot of games to be excited about.
I agree. And you mentioned there are no bye weeks. So each week there's more importance. There's not much margin for error this go around. And it makes these trap games mean even more for teams that are, trying to get on a run. And if they're not covering all their bases, teams with high expectations might trip up over their own feet with these bye games, or with these trap games rather. And it's going to prove in the standings.
For those who haven't had a chance to spend a lot of time on the site or read any of the recent pieces, who do you have coming out of the East? Who do you have coming out of the West? And who wins this whole enchilada?
Yeah, for sure. So coming out of the East, I have Ohio State, and I have that just because I have faith in them running their schedule and going out strong against Michigan State and Michigan. And then coming out of the West, I have Wisconsin again. They've matched up with Ohio State in the title game several times over the last handful of years. And as much as I would love to see Minnesota take over the strong start from last season and run it into a Big Ten title appearance, kind of like how Northwestern surprised us a few years ago, I think Wisconsin will hold it down, especially with the home matchup against Minnesota on November 28th. That could determine who goes in the West, barring any surprises. So I think another Ohio State-Wisconsin matchup in the Big Ten title game could be in the cards again.
Let everybody in on a little secret. There are times that we all may agree with our picks when we write our stories, and then somebody has to go in and change their pick just so it's not boring and we all have the same picks. I have a feeling that's going to happen this year. I tend to think Wisconsin comes out of the West too, but for the sake of non-uniformity, I'm going to take Iowa, and I'm going to say it's going to be Ohio State and Iowa. And why I like Iowa is I think that just their schedule, I mean, sets up in a good way with having Nebraska. And I'm not saying Nebraska is going to set the world on fire this year, but having Wisconsin at home, having Nebraska at home, having Northwestern at home. I mean, they're big non-conference road games. I mean, they start off right out of the gate against Purdue and West Lafayette, and they do have Minnesota up in Minneapolis, but I think it's the years that everybody is sleeping on Iowa are the years that Iowa actually does pretty well. Kirk Ferentz just maximizes rosters that maybe are not as deep as some of the other division mates. And I don't know. I just can't seem to get away from picking Iowa there. I don't think you're going to see any dissent in terms of the East. I don't think you're going to see anybody saying that Ohio State's going to trip up along the way. Maybe you will. I don't know. I mean, you have to play the games, but I think it's going to be Ohio State and Iowa. They're going to play that game that they were supposed to play this year as part of the nine game schedule, but instead of playing it in Columbus, they'll be playing it in Indianapolis.
I'd like to see that matchup because when Schedule 3.0 came out, Ohio State isn't going to be playing Iowa or Purdue in the regular season to get that chance to have revenge from the losses several seasons ago. So having that kind of storyline go in a Big Ten title game, some Champions Week, Ohio State and Iowa, makes for a good draw notes-wise. I'd really be surprised to see Iowa take down Wisconsin that final week of the season. But like you said, they do have it at home, so there's a little bit of odds in their favor come December 12th. Wouldn't be too surprised, but then again, I am surprised with your pick.
I'm going to wrap it up with this final question as we have our prediction hats on. Does Ohio State make it to the college football playoff? I'm not going to predict. I'm not going to ask us to predict any success or anything along those lines. Just do they make it? Yes or no? and maybe support your show your work?
Yes, Ohio State makes it to the college football playoff, and that's if there are no outbreaks on the team that takes some talent away, allowing for trip ups to happen. But we were looking at the USA Today polls this weekend, and Ohio State had 2 first place votes, even though they haven't played a game and they weren't supposed to play a game this fall. And so the support for Ohio State is widespread, of course. And I think if they play their schedule, they take care of business handedly. They obviously will have a chance to revisit the college football playoff. And if they take care of business, and like Fields said the other day, they go undefeated, they have a chance to go in with a relatively high seed and avoid another matchup with Clemson in the semis.
Yeah, I think they make it as well, too. There certainly are a lot of people out there, and by that I mean mostly fans of other conferences that are already trying to disqualify Ohio State. Oh, you're only going to play 8 games. And honestly, it's going to be 9, but, why let facts get in the way of a good argument? Ohio State's only going to play 8 games. They're not starting until late October. I think as long as Ohio State plays of its 9 games, I think as long as they play 7 or 8 of them and they go out and they look convincing in their wins, it's going to be impossible to keep them out. It really is. And you talked about the USA Today coaches poll that came out over the weekend. It's a situation that's different than the AP. The AP, you can't put the Big Ten teams back in until this next week, but there was no such stipulation in the coaches poll. 2 first place votes, but ranked 10th behind Texas and some teams like that. Have no worries. I mean, once we get through the schedule, everybody's like, oh, we're going to have all these undefeated teams. We never have all these undefeated teams. When you're playing league-only schedules, you can only have one team standing at the end after a championship game anyway. So, under best case scenario, the Pac-12 comes back and maybe somehow gets themselves in the mix. It doesn't even sound like they come back much before November 7th. That may be difficult, but let's just even throw them in for the sake of the argument. You have the Power 5 leagues and maybe one group of 5 team, maybe Cincinnati, maybe UCF. I don't know, but a group of 5 team comes out. At best, you have 6 to get down to 4, but we never have 6. We never have 4. Maybe 3 under the fullest of full moons, but generally it's 1 or 2. And if Ohio State takes care of business and wins all of its games, that's going to be fine. And I rewind to a moment not too long ago where people were coming out when the Big Ten was definitely on the sideline saying, well, the SEC champion may have 2 losses. I don't know if I'm buying that. I don't think the SEC is that deep this year. I think LSU takes a step back. I don't think that coming out of the East, I don't think you see Georgia and Florida. I don't think you see the loser of that game really having much of an argument at that point. I think it's pretty easy to see Ohio State making it into the playoff, provided it takes care of business, pass all of the look test things and whatnot. And if Ohio State certainly is a higher seed in there, with the national semis being at the Rose and the Sugar Bowl, and the majority cluster of the other power teams in college football all kind of being in the Southeast, I think you could see Ohio State spending New Year's at least quarantined in a Pasadena hotel as they play in the Rose Bowl.
I'm sure they wouldn't complain about that at all, especially if they take care of business come that time. And you did mention the SEC and the ACC. It's been interesting watching Clemson so far. I know Trevor Lawrence has looked, stayed impressive for his case. And I'm interested to see what the SEC is going to do when they join the rest of them currently playing here this upcoming weekend and so forth.
Yeah, let's not get too excited about what they did against the Citadel, but he only played a half, and he is really good. I mean, he is really good. They had to replace a lot, appear not to have missed a beat. I don't have their schedule in front of me. I'm going to see if I can filibuster long enough to get the schedule up before I decide to sign us off here. But what are they going to do against Notre Dame? What are they going to do? I mean, that game is November 7th, But if you sit there and you look at their schedule of what they have, I mean, a lot of people may talk about that the game on the 10th of October against Miami. You know, Miami, yeah, they look good in their last game, but you know, I'm not quite ready to anoint them anything yet at this point. So it's gonna be an interesting run, and you're gonna have to bring it every week. But you know, I want to give you a final thought for any closing thoughts before we wrap this up. We've already gone 45 minutes, by far one of our longest shows, but I think it's just really cathartic to be able to talk football through all of these years of or after all these weeks and months with us looking at how are we going to have any content to talk about.
Oh man, I agree. I'm glad that we'll have some games to cover, and we won't have to spend our time looking at these flashbacks. Rather, we can look forward towards the present and the future. And my closing thoughts, I guess, are more of closing hopes. I hope everybody on all teams stay healthy, because football is best played when the best talent is on the field. And so as long as these teams stay healthy, they do their business, they quarantine, they follow the protocols, I'm really excited to watch the Big Ten and the rest of the Power Five and all of college football. I'm thankful that they do get to play this ball.
Absolutely. I just can't wait until we have some games that actually matter. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm saying that only Big Ten games matter. There are going to be some stinkers on that schedule, but we've gone through a couple of weeks, and I've seen more Coastal Carolina games and Arkansas State games than I can ever remember. And you know, the conference schedules to this point with the ACC and the Big 12 have been pretty mediocre at best. The SEC comes to play this upcoming week, and then we have about a month to go until the Big Ten plays. So, I mean, everybody, you know, just, you know, make smart decisions out there, and, you know, we're going to have some football soon enough. So I want to thank Jacob for joining us here on the BIA podcast, and you can always catch all of his content as well as mine over on BuckeyeGrove.com. If you are not a member, over the next couple of days, we have a great offer going right now where if for new members, you get 50% off your first year plus a $28 credit to BreakingT.com, so you can get yourself a great t-shirt as well. Use the offer code GOBUCKS2020. If you have any questions, just shoot me an email over at Kevin at BuckeyeGrove.com. And, you know, don't be a stranger. If you have any feedback on the show, be sure to post it over on the board or send me an email. And we look forward to bringing you our next show here on the BIA podcast. Thanks for listening.
Be sure to stay up to date with Buckeye Grove Instant Access when the news breaks or after the big game. Exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher as part of the Unscripted Ohio Podcast Network. Hit that subscribe button so you can stay in the know and never miss a single episode.